afternoon, everyone. I'm Patrick Eccles, Senior Associate Director in the Global Learning Office. I'd like to welcome everyone to GLO's GLOVicariously webinar series. Just a quick reminder that today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will then be available on the GLOVicariously page of the GLO website. Today's topic is the micro-consignment model, creating dignified opportunity from uncertainty. And to introduce today's speaker, we have GESI Guatemala 2019 alum, Lucia Boyd.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks everyone for joining us today. The webinar will last approximately 1 hour with the presentation followed by a Q&A. All participants will remain muted, so feel free to send any of your questions to the chat Q&A, and I will collect them to answer after the presentation. You're welcome to turn on your cameras or keep them turned off. We'll also launch a quick poll at the end. And to introduce our speaker, Greg Van Kirk is a social entrepreneur, consultant, and educator. He's the principal designer of the award-winning MicroConsignment Model, now being applied globally. He's the founder of multiple organizations, including Social Entrepreneur Corps. Greg is a former Ashoka Leadership Group member, a two-time Ashoka Globalizer Fellow and World Economic Forum Social Entrepreneur of the Year for 2012 Latin America. Over the course of 20 years, he's worked with a diverse variety of organizations, leaders, and communities, and has served as a consultant for organizations such as the Levi Strauss Foundation, Solutions Journalism Network, USAID, Economics, Vision Spring, Source Foundation, Church World Service, Inter-American Development Bank, Water for People, and Fundación por Agua in the US, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. He also contributes time as social entrepreneur in residence at universities and has taught social entrepreneurship at Columbia University and NYU, amongst others. Greg began working in rural small business development as a Guatemala Peace Corps volunteer in 2001. He worked in investment banking for 5 years before arriving in Guatemala. 2 deals he led at UBS during his time won Deal of the Year and honors from Structured Finance International magazine. He is a senior advisor for the Miami University Institute for Entrepreneurship. And we are so thankful that you're here today, Greg, and I'll pass it on to you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. Forgive me for that. I think that was a bio that I sent for an extremely long introduction there. So sorry about that, Lucia. Probably like a little bit like being on a chicken bus in Guatemala, I think, probably reading through all of that. So no, thank you so much for the introduction. Patrick, Jessica, the entire team, thank you so much for having me. And as always, it's such a pleasure working with everyone, the whole team and the students at Northwestern, at GESI. By way of background, we've been working together for, I want to say, about 7 years now, if I'm right. And so it's just been a wonderful collaborative relationship. And so much of what I'm going to talk about today with regards to the micro-consignment model and the lessons learned and insights that you can extrapolate from that are about collaboration as well. That this is really about, at its heart, as any social innovation, social entrepreneurship is, it's really about collaboration and teamwork and partnership. And that's really the only way that we can effectuate any type of high impact and sustainable change. So what I'll do is I'll jump, I'm going to share my screen and then just sort of jump into the presentation. And we're going to go about an hour, but I will most certainly not go anywhere near that. I want to leave it more open for a conversation and respectful of the fact that people are probably on their computers and on Zoom for extended periods of time these days. But I think we can cover what we need to in about 20 minutes and then open it up for a dialogue. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Alrighty, so what I've titled this is the micro-consignment model, creating dignified opportunity from uncertainty. And what I'd like to do is first just touch on very briefly the definition that we use as a team for social entrepreneurship. Then I'd like to just provide a little bit of background for context. I think it's important just to give a little bit of my background in terms of first initiating the design of this so that you can understand the context of it. Then explain the micro-consignment model as briefly as I can. And then I want to jump into some insights and lessons learned along the way, oftentimes by falling down many times and getting back up, that can ideally be applied to any type of work that you're doing in the social impact space. So, so first of all, getting into social entrepreneurship, there are a lot of definitions of social entrepreneurship and a lot of different ways that people use the term, and oftentimes the thought is that it's about creating revenue generating solutions, business solutions to solve social problems. To my mind, and I think the history and certainly the ongoing approach of it doesn't necessarily bear that out. I think that's a simple definition. I think people jump to that because of the word entrepreneurship. If you look at some of the great quote unquote social entrepreneurs throughout history, you go back to Clara Barton, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., what have you. It has absolutely nothing to do with business. To my mind, it's really just about empowering, playing a positive role in people becoming empowered, communities becoming empowered, organizations becoming empowered. It's about empowering system changing. There's a system that is broken or that doesn't exist or that's suboptimal. Social impact, obviously positive social impact. We're trying to do this to create positive change at scale, or I would even say that can scale. I oftentimes think a misconception too is that, if you're not serving 1 million people, then it's not social entrepreneurship. I think that's a very exclusive way to look at it when it should be as inclusive as possible. So are we playing a positive role in empowering system changing social impact? That can scale. And that's really it. And I think where the entrepreneurship piece comes in, is more about the approach, because this is an approach, and I think oftentimes it's aspirational. It's not you are a social entrepreneur, you aren't. It's not binary. It's are you taking an approach to create this empowering system changing social impact at scale? And the word entrepreneurship comes in, and because if we think about entrepreneurs, business entrepreneurs, we think about what does it take, or what are the characteristics or qualities that we see in a business entrepreneur or an entrepreneurial organization. It's about risk taking. It's about persistence. It's about creativity. It's about innovation, right? We can all think of famous entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs we know down the street who share those qualities. However, in business entrepreneurship, the indicator of success, not necessarily what drives the entrepreneur, but the indicator of success is, is profitability or value. Well, when we talk about social entrepreneurship, all we're simply saying is, in order to achieve those goals that I've stated, is we're taking that entrepreneurial approach and substituting increased social impact for increased profitability or shareholder value. So the entrepreneurship is not about the business, it's about the approach that we're taking. So I just wanted to use that as an overall framing as we dive into this, and to set aside any, disabuse any misconceptions that I believe that center around the social entrepreneurship terminology. So what's the micro-consignment model? And I guess first, how did it come about? By way of a bit of context, I first, as was noted, I worked in investment banking, and then I actually read about Muhammad Yunus and microfinance, and became inspired or there's sort of a trigger, a catalytic, sort of a catalytic moment for me to create a change. And so I hung up my suit and tie and went into the Peace Corps. And when I was in the Peace Corps, I ended up in Guatemala. I ended up in rural Guatemala, up in the western highlands of Guatemala, in an area called the Ashil region. And it was an area that had been hard hit by the genocide of the early 80s. And it was a challenge, and it was an opportunity because I was the first Peace Corps volunteer back there. This was way back in 2001 now, since I think 1982. But so I was living in this very rural community that needed a lot of support. As always, just incredible, wonderful, creative people. But looking for some new ideas and new ways of going about trying and doing some things. And so I worked in microfinance. I worked to help set up an internet center. And then I ended up having this idea to start a restaurant because first of all, I knew nothing about restaurants. I worked as a manager in a deli when I was 16 and didn't do a very good job of that. And I delivered pizzas, I think, and showed up far past the 30-minute time period. But that was my restaurant experience. But what I had recognized is that a restaurant, to make a long story short, starting a restaurant could be potentially a great way to create some jobs and bring new money, tourism money, a restaurant geared towards both locals and tourists into the community. Because in so many, as we all recognize, in so many communities, especially in very rural, remote, isolated communities, there's not a lot of new money that comes in oftentimes, except through agriculture or remittances, or when people go, say, to a different part of the country and cut sugarcane or what have you during certain periods of time. So I started a restaurant with about $4,000 that I had saved up when I was working back in New York in banking. And the Peace Corps is very generous in letting me do this as a side project, which pretty much ended up consuming me, for anybody who's ever worked in a restaurant. And my deal was that what I had said was I'd identify leadership and turn it over to them through sweat equity. And then I would, and then as well, if we, knock on wood, made any money that we didn't reinvest, that I would contribute it to local community projects. So fortunately, we did do well. We reinvested and started a whole bunch of additional tourism businesses and an education center. But one of the things that we did, which was really what led to the micro-consignment model, was we donated some money to a youth group that was building cook stoves in a nearby community. And for those who aren't familiar, most people in the world, if you've heard about, say, the cook stove, the Clean Cook Stove Alliance or what have you, but most people in the world and in lower income, more remote communities, still cook on the floor or cook with some type of a stove that doesn't have a chimney. And this was the case in this community that this youth group was going to build stoves in, called La Pista, or called Akchumbal in the local language of Ixil. And so I donated money, a few $100s. We donated a few $100s to this youth group. They built some stoves, and then I went out to visit the project. And what I saw was just the incredible impact that a cook stove has on a family's life. And I still think to this day, for so many families like the ones that with whom I lived and worked in Guatemala, it can probably be one of, if not the most important purchase in their life. Because when you've been cooking on the floor, you suffer from respiratory illnesses. It's very inefficient. It's very costly. And when you have a simple cook stove with a chimney, it fundamentally changes your life. You save time, you save money. It's better for your health. Children can afford to go to school. The ripple effects are tremendous. So I saw the impact of the cook stove, and then I thought, well, aren't there cook stove businesses around here? Because this is how, ideally where you would get to, where local people are building and selling their own cook stoves. And the fact was that there were not. So what I saw is that typically stoves were being donated by NGOs sporadically, or maybe people were building them one-off. And so what I thought was, well, why don't, I started a restaurant, didn't really know anything about that. I worked with some great people that made all of that possible. I know some great people in these communities. Why don't we try to build a cook stove business for local people so that local people can get out and promote cook stoves? And so what I ran into in trying to do this was this challenge. And that's what I'll dive into on this slide here. Essentially, if you look at the spectrum, let's say, of where things are and where you start, and we'll use cook stoves as the example. On one end of the spectrum is you have people who are trying to survive. They need their basic needs taken care of. And so that's typically where you see relief work, where you see donations, right? Typically donations and relief work are after a natural disaster, obviously, and we can have man-made disaster, what have you, but that's where we need to have donations. Well, in this area where I was in La Pista, it was past that stage. These people weren't in a survival stage. Donations, you were never going to have enough money to donate enough stoves, and I'll talk about why that isn't always the best answer as well, to be able to solve all the needs. So that didn't work, right? On the other end of the spectrum, what you have is an efficient marketplace. You think about so many just normal businesses, that there's an efficient marketplace, there's competition, there's supply chains, there are entrepreneurs who are working in it, there are companies, businesses, what have you. Obviously, that's where we want to try to get to. And again, it's not to say that everything should be a business solution. Of course it shouldn't. But when we're talking about something like cook stoves, or we'll talk about glasses or solar lamps or what have you, the way to scale is obviously through some type of a business market solution. So you have these two ends of the spectrum. And where we found is that we were somewhere in the middle. And so when I first went out, and having worked in microfinance, I sort of started at one end. I said, okay, well, donations aren't going to be the solution long-term, donating stoves. So why don't we start with, what about microfinance? What if I found some local entrepreneurs and said, hey, if you want to start a stove business, I've got a little bit of money. I can lend you some money, and you can go out and start your own stove business, and I'll give you a loan with a really low interest rate, and you just pay me back over time, like any type of microfinance mechanism would work. Well, when I proposed that to people, they said, that doesn't work, because we don't know anything about selling stoves, and nobody's ever bought stoves before. Right? So it wasn't this other end of the spectrum, efficient marketplace where people only needed capital. Right? There was a lot of uncertainty. Right? Microfinance typically works, and when it was first started, was a recognition that women in particular have these businesses, they're doing well. They just simply need more money to be able to buy more things, to sell more things, to make more money. Right? It was much more efficient marketplace. There's risk, there's calculable risk, and people understand their businesses. This was not the case for stoves. Nobody had ever sold them. There was uncertainty in the market, and nobody had ever sold them, so there was uncertainty in the market, and nobody ever sold them, so people had uncertainty about themselves and their own ability to run the business. So you had this total uncertainty. And so what I realized is okay, well, I'm going to have to convert some of that uncertainty to risk, so that people will be willing to take a chance. And so I looked at micro-franchising, which is micro-franchising is typically when you've got sort of a business in a box, and think about a franchise, right? It's here's how everything works, and you have to take out a loan or put in some of your own money, and then we'll give you the whole franchise and the business in a box idea. So I offered that idea to people and said, okay, what if we build the business, and then you just take out a loan, I'll teach you how to do everything, you'll teach me, we'll learn together. And the answer was, thank you again, but no, Gregorio, that's not going to work, right? Why? Again, because we get back to this point of uncertainty, because it didn't lower the uncertainty enough. And if you think about it, for any of us that are here listening on this, would you start a business that you didn't know anything about, where you had a lot of doubts about the marketplace, and do it with 100% debt? No, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? It's too much risk. It's too much risk for you based on a lot of uncertainty outside of that. And so where I ended up landing was to say, okay, well, how about this? What if we work on building this stove business together and how it all works? And, I'm here as an advisor and help to design it, and, coming from my business experience and such, you teach me all the local things, we'll learn from each other. And then instead of you taking out a loan, what if I give you all of the materials for the stoves and the money that you need to go out and do marketing and such? And then when you sell it, you don't have to invest anything but your time and your energy. And then after you sell a stove, you keep a part of the money, you give the rest back to me, and then I reinvested in the business. And that's where micro-consignment came from. It was essentially looking at, we're in this middle of this, we're in this gray area of economic development, and we're closer to, say, donations than we are to an efficient marketplace, which means there's a lot more uncertainty about people starting up their own things. And so how could we convert uncertainty to risk by essentially saying, you put in what you're able to put in, because you don't have money, you can't afford to risk the limited money that you have. You put in your time, your energy, your local knowledge, all this incredible assets that you bring to this. And then I'll put in what I can put in, which is money and some time and ideas and such. And then let's work that way. And with consignment, we bear the financial risk because we can best bear it rather than the local entrepreneur. And worst case, if it doesn't work out, they simply give everything back and can stop, and they're no worse off financially, right? So what does that mean? So that's the basic model. So forgive me if I digress a little bit into a little bit too much of the minutia of it, but it's essentially about giving people things up front so that they pay for it later rather than paying for it in the beginning. Okay. So what are some of this? So this was way back in 2001, 2002 that we started. So what, along the way of all these years of doing this, what are some key insights that I've seen are applicable to other work in this space? And I think essentially to any work that you're doing. This doesn't just have to be about social entrepreneurship. So I want to touch on a number of here, and what you'll see is many of these are simply about core values, and it's about how do you put your guiding principles and your core values in action. And so first and foremost, what really makes the micro-consignment model tick is, not surprisingly, empathy. Right? And if you think about, we have primarily at this point in time, we have women entrepreneurs supporting other women entrepreneurs. And for a bit more context, after we started the micro-consignment model we first started as the stove model, then what we learned soon after was that actually this could work for other things like eyeglasses and solar lamps and water filters. And so we expanded what we were doing to go not only to try to scale, when we talk about scale, to scale geographically, but as well to scale in a deep way so that every time that an entrepreneur went to a community, they had a number of things that they could offer. And so we started in La Pista with his cook stoves. Then we scaled out throughout Guatemala, adding more and more products and services, identifying that mostly women were the ones who were the most adept at doing this. And then we scaled to other countries throughout Latin America primarily. And so, what we learned away and how this comes back to empathy is that, if you take a step back and think about, what is it, how do we have empathy? Because it is a muscle, and it's something that needs to be sparked, and it's something that needs to be practiced, and it's something that we need to continue. It's a verb that we need to continue to work on. And so, there's a good friend of mine who's at Notre Dame now at the Center for Ethical Leadership, who does a lot of work on empathy and neuroscience and such. And I remember years ago him sharing with me that there are, his name is Chris Atkins, that there are sort of 3 ways that we quote unquote trigger our empathy. The first way is that we're naturally empathetic when someone close to us, a family member, a sister, a brother, a mother, a father, something happens to them, right? We can naturally sort of get it and understand how they're feeling because we have this very, very deep and close relationship. So that's one way that we have empathy. All right. The second way that we have empathy is if you look at people who maybe aren't close, can be total strangers, and yet have shared similar experiences. So think about Alcoholics Anonymous. People come together, they don't know each other at all, and yet they're like, I get you, you get me, right? There's that natural empathy. And the third trigger of empathy is physical proximity, right? That's why things like the Peace Corps exist. That's why things like Social Entrepreneur Corps exist, right? Why are those so important oftentimes for folks like, folks who look like me working in this? Why is that so critical? Because the communities that we hope to be supportive of, I don't have maybe family, right? We don't maybe have shared similar culture. We come from very different cultures oftentimes. So the only way that we can truly be empathetic, is to go and live and work with people and create mutual empathy amongst ourselves. And so you have these 3 triggers of empathy. And so, if you look at to the extent that the success that we had with the micro-consignment model, right? In retrospect, why is it that the women entrepreneurs who are so successful, amongst many other reasons, a big thumbs up to women, is because they actually had all 3 triggers of empathy, right? Because we had women, we had women entrepreneurs who were working in communities right near them, so they had relationships with people, right? They also had shared similar life experiences. right? And then they would go out as part of the model, go out to people's homes, homes that look like their homes, right? So they lived in the same way, they lived close to each other, they experienced the same day-to-day things. So these three very powerful triggers for empathy. And so, sort of the takeaway being that when you're building a model or you're thinking about, social innovation, it's no wonder that people from communities are the most powerful advocates oftentimes, and people from their own communities are the ones who are truly, truly, the change makers, because they have all three triggers of empathy. They truly get it. They truly understand it. And so much of this is about nuance. So to the extent that you're doing any of this work, to the extent that you can work with it, you can play a positive role in helping local community members take the lead. That's when you'll have the most profound results. And that's certainly what we experienced with the micro-consignment model. The second thing I wanted to touch on, is certainly learned, was about, this is all about empowerment, right? And again, as I said, you can't empower someone else, but you can play a positive role in someone becoming more empowered. Right? And on a very basic level, one of the ways that I would define empowerment is A plus I plus M, so AIM. And so if you think about anything, think about your own experiences. Right? You really need these three components. You need to have the ability to do something, which means your knowledge and the skills. You need you need incentives. You need to be motivated, and you need to not have disincentives. And the M, you need the means, you need the resources. So if you're looking to achieve anything, if anyone is looking to achieve anything, those three, the A, the I, and the M, are essential components. And if you don't have one, you are effectively disempowered. And if you think about where so many development projects go wrong, so much of our work unintentionally doesn't work well, it's maybe because we solved the problem of resources, but we didn't solve the problem of skills. Or maybe we just focused on knowledge, but we didn't focus on skills. Or, so many organizations I would see working with artisans in Guatemala when I first arrived, and they'd be teaching artisans how to make new products, but they didn't provide any resources, right? So the women weren't empowered to actually create change. So if you think about the micro-consignment model, what we really focused on intuitively to begin with, and then much more expressly, was, what does a woman entrepreneur need, for example, who's giving basic eye exams and selling reading glasses, of which 95% of people in the world over 40 are going to need? Well, she needs the basic knowledge about eye care. She needs basic knowledge about how to give an exam, and about glasses, and all of those, vision care, all of those things. So got to tick that box, or is she becoming empowered in that way? She needs the skills, right? That means experiential learning, on the job training. You got to actually get out to a community and do it. She needs the incentives, right? Certainly we could spend an entire conversation talking about incentives, because I think that is the most challenging thing, where we get it wrong. Oftentimes, we often thought, okay, well, the incentive is money. People need to make money. Yes, money is necessary, but insufficient, right? If you think about any of us on this, in this conversation, are you only motivated by money? No, you're motivated by community, by purpose, by family, by trying to set an example, by self-actualization, by fun, by a whole host of other things. So coming up with the right incentive mix is always an ongoing challenge and opportunity as well. But that was something that we had to address. And then the means, right, is importing products from China, importing products from India, buying products locally, right? I oftentimes thought that, that sort of supply chain of getting something from one place to another was the toughest part. You had to be able to get the means, the resources necessary. But actually, I think, certainly over time, that's become much, much more easier. But point being is, what we learned is, if we're not addressing each one of these points, and this goes for any work, if you're not addressing the ability, you're not addressing the incentive, you're not addressing the resource needs, you're missing something in the equation, then people aren't going to be empowered to effectuate positive change. All right. So it's keeping your eye on the A, the I, and the M. The third part is about dignity. And, I use this as an example, and this is in no way, shape, or form to be judgmental or disparaging, but simply for critical thinking purposes. But, if you look at the three pictures here, what I have is, there's a picture of of a young person with a pair of these round glasses. And if you pump liquid into these glasses, different levels of liquid, then you can solve all kinds of refractive errors. Essentially, it's one pair of glasses that can solve vision problems for potentially billions of people. Right? Second, you have something that's called the play pump, and it's a merry-go-round. Children play on a merry-go-round that pulls up water from a well, which then goes into a storage tank and then can provide water for a local community. And then you have a thing over called the socket ball, which you kick a ball around and it creates energy in ways that I couldn't possibly understand. And then you put a solar light on it at the end of the day, and the energy from kicking the ball around creates an opportunity to have light. And if you think about these, these are millions upon millions of dollars, and amazing, passionate, driven people worked on these. What do they all have in common? And oftentimes the response can be like, wow, those are amazing, right? Well, unfortunately, what they all have in common is by and large, they're all failures, right? And why? And oftentimes it just gets down to a really simple reason, and it's human dignity. And you have to always ask yourself in anything that you're doing am I willing to do the thing that I'm asking somebody else to use or to do? Right? So you have these big round glasses, right? Would you wear those to school? What would happen if you, when you're a kid and you walked into school with glasses that look like that? You get made fun of, right? To get water in your community, you have to send your kids out to play on a merry-go-round. Right? To get light, you have to ask your daughter to go play soccer, right? Apart from how many people play soccer, so who gets the ball, right? So the fact of the matter is, they're not dignified solutions, right? If I wouldn't use them, I certainly can't ask somebody else to do it, right? And so, if you think about dignity and you think about the micro-consignment model or using a market mechanism, one of the examples that I would use oftentimes is an ugly sweater. And I know that ugly sweaters are very popular at Christmas time, but I'm talking about a really freaking ugly sweater, right? And so let's assume that that Jessica has an aunt, and the aunt, we'll call her Aunt Joan. And so Aunt Joan thinks Jessica wants a sweater, really into those ugly sweaters. And let's just assume that, Jessica celebrates Christmas. And so Aunt Joan buys a really ugly sweater, really freaking ugly sweater, gives to Jessica, puts it in a box. Christmas morning, Jessica opens up the box and sees this really freaking ugly sweater that she would never, ever wear. What does Jessica say to Joan? What would anybody say? Thank you. Right? Thank you. I love it. It's wonderful. Right? What does Aunt Joan do? She pumps her fist, says, yes, nailed it. She loved the sweater, goes back and tells her friends, yeah, Jessica loved that sweater. And then what does she get her next Christmas? Another really ugly sweater, right? That's what Joan gets her. Yeah, what does Jessica do with the sweater? She puts it in her drawer, she donates it, and she never wears it. Right? Now think about that in terms of technologies, or think about that in terms of so much of what we do, and I'll think about that in terms of cook stoves, where we first started. Again, donations are really important sometimes, right? Oftentimes super, super important. Relief work is critically important. This is not about either or, right? It's about when and why. So if you think about a nonprofit shows up to an organization in Guatemala, has a cook stove, it's probably not the right, maybe it's not the right size, maybe the chimney isn't long enough, and says, Maria, we'd like to give this stove to you. Right? Maria looks at it, says, I'm never going to use that thing, in her own little thought bubble. What does Maria say to the NGO? Thank you, this is wonderful. What does the NGO do? It turns around, says, excellent, puts it on a report. We gave out another sweater. They thanked us, right? And goes and raises more money to be able to buy more materials, to be able to give away more cook stoves. That, obviously, it's a little bit of hyperbole, but that nobody's going to use, right? So one of the things we learned through the micro-consignment model is that, yes, important to give things sometimes, but in addition to that, that a market mechanism can, if you do it well and with intention and working together with people, can help you to offer more dignified solutions. The reason being is because if I go to, and we've experienced this over and over and over and over again, we like to experience it less than we do, but if we go to a community and say, hey, we have this cook stove, and if they don't like it, and we say, would you buy it? If they don't like it, they're going to say no. They get to make a choice. When there is a market mechanism, you are offering people an opportunity to make a choice and express their point of view, which is great, because then you get to say, well, why don't you like it? And they tell you, and you get to turn around and make some modifications and go back and actually serve people in the way that is the most dignified, in ways that they're going to use things. So it's about using a market mechanism in the right way can get to a dignified approach, which creates not just access, but actual adoption and ownership, and the ability to go and solve more and more problems in more creative ways. A few more points here. One is, oftentimes people will ask, well, ask about paternalism and how do you avoid paternalism, right? Paternalism takes so many different forms, and not necessarily intent, but overall, to my mind, it's about, can you offer people informed opportunities, right? Paternalism is so much of saying, do this, or this is what we're going to do for you. Opportunity is people get to choose yes or no. And so one of the things that we learned along the way was, if you think about recruiting women entrepreneurs for the first time, this is a totally new type of endeavor. We're asking people to come and learn how to give basic eye exams and sell reading glasses, or learn about cook stoves and promote cook stoves. They've never done this before, right? These businesses didn't exist before. And the way that we were going about doing it was very different. So to ask somebody for a resume that they don't have and make a judgment to quote unquote hire somebody sight unseen, or maybe after a couple interviews, doesn't really work. And so what we decided to do is design an informed opportunity for people to learn and for us to learn. And so that gets into what I think is so often key in this type of work, is building in a self-selection mechanism, is give people an informed opportunity to learn and to opt in or to opt out. Right? And so in our case, for example, strategically, we would get, say, 10 women together and present the opportunity and say, if you're interested, come back in a week and we'll give a training. And then if you're interested after that, come back in another week and we'll talk about it some more. And then we'll go out in the field and you'll start to earn money actually as you're learning, because you're out giving eyes and selling reading glasses, with the strategic idea that when we provide this opportunity, it is only typically the innovators, right, maybe sort of 2 to 10% or 15%, the innovators and the early adopters, who are really going to take charge of it. And so our strategy is, over time, if we start with 10 people, if we end up with 2 women, then that's success, right? We gave them an opportunity, they gave us an opportunity, and then over time, there was a real sense of ownership. And so in any type of this work, because it is oftentimes so new and innovative in what you're doing, and people don't know each other, they're not familiar with each other, familiar communities, can you start working together to learn about the opportunity together, and then allow people to make choices for themselves? Because as well, that's when they'll really own it. I think it's about trust. People would often ask, when we started with the micro-consignment models, do we have them sign a contract, right? Because if you think we're consigning oftentimes hundreds of dollars worth of things to people that we've only known for a few weeks. And so, do we have them sign a contract? Do they have to put collateral or what have you? Well, there are some practical reasons why that doesn't work, just from a financial or, collateral perspective. But by and large, the answer is no. Because, I firmly believe that this work is all about trust. And it's not just about, it's about implied trust. And if you want to co-create and build things together, the best way to do it is to be sitting metaphorically on the same side of the table. And if I have you sign a contract up front, or vice versa, we're metaphorically sitting on opposite sides of the table. And so
what we do is try to create trustful relationships. And this goes for any of this work. And I've seen this break down so many times in my experience with organizations, is that we enter with the thought of we trust each other. Then bit by bit, we do little things or build in little mechanisms or little pieces of accountability, right, that imply mistrust. And that breaks down the co-creative process, and it breaks down the ability for us to work together towards a common goal oftentimes. And so, in addition to that, I firmly believe that when you give trust, you get trust. And certainly that's what we saw. And so really key learning, be trusting. Better to fail because you trust, and fail later because you trusted in something that went wrong, or fail right in the beginning because you entered with mistrust, and you'll never understand what could have potentially happened. Another key point is learning that this is about, I've heard a good friend, Kofi Taha at MIT D Lab, we were talking recently, he's talking about the prepositions of design. And there's design with, there's design for, and there's designed by. Right? If you think about designed for, let's say it's Steve Jobs and his team sitting there coming up with the iPad, right? This wasn't designed with people. They had this idea, and nobody ever thought it was going to be necessary, but they're really, really good at it, right? And so designing for other people can work, right? On the other extreme is it's designed by, right? So that's empowering, playing some type of capacity building role so that local communities, with as much or ideally as little as possible capacity building, will just design things by themselves, right? And how can we play a positive role in that? Right? In the middle of that is design with, right? Which is oftentimes at this work. And so gets back to trust, gets back to empowerment, all these people, is how do you really focus on working with and not for, right? And, I'm here talking about the micro-consignment model, but there are hundreds, if not thousands of other people that actually contributed to the design. I may have sort of sparked the first idea, but the only reason that it's worked is because of building in through the micro-consignment model, through building in feedback loops, the opportunity for us to design with each other. And that's how we learned how to price, and that's how we learned how to market, and that's how we learn, obviously, which products might work, right? So over and over, building in mechanisms where if you're designing with, where you're creating relationships so that you can do that, and being very aware that sometimes you're going to skew a little bit in designing for, sometimes obviously it's going to be a little bit designing by, but how do you keep the tenets in practice to make sure that it's a with, that it's a co-creative effort? One thing as well, I think people oftentimes, certainly I see this so often, is we misdiagnose, if I can say, design constraints and problems. Right? So a problem is something, in my words, a problem is something that is, say, it's solvable over a short period of time, that you have some agency over, that you can ideally work to change. That's a problem. Right? We are in the problem-solving business. And then there are other things that are design constraints that, we only have 24 hours in the day. We have limited time, limited resources, limited money, limitation everywhere around us, especially in the environments where we're working. There's certain things that are just externalities, or things that you just simply aren't going to be able to change. And if you design it as a problem and you decide to work to try to solve it, you're just going to keep banging your head against the wall. But if you think about it as a design constraint, as sort of part of what forms my box of the thinking and my innovation, well, then I can work with it. Instead of fighting against it, how do I work with it? So one example, for example, when women entrepreneurs were out marketing in communities, is they would hang up flyers on telephone posts, or on the houses, or at the municipality, or what have you. And then they would come back and say, hey, well, people keep taking down our flyers. We're about to have this campaign on Saturday, and we want all these people to show up. We put in all these flyers, and people are taking them down all the time. And so we had a conversation, said, okay, we really can't do anything about that. Right? We're not going to change people's behavior about taking down flyers. But let's think about this in a different way. What do people really like? Well, in Guatemala, as Patrick can attest to, oftentimes people just love calendars. right? I mean, when you think about, you know, Christmas, you know, what do businesses give out oftentimes to their customers? They give out calendars. And so we thought, okay, well, let's work with this thing. Why don't we, on the marketing materials, why don't we put a calendar on it, right? And we'll print those out so that then if people take it, they take it down, what do they do with it? Ideally, they'll put it in their house, right? And now we have a permanent source of quote unquote marketing in people's house because they want to have the calendar and the marketing comes with it. So if our campaign, people didn't show up today or they weren't interested today, they'll continually be seeing it and say, hey, maybe I'll get a cook stove next week or next month or in 6 months. So it's the idea about how to frame things, understanding the difference in your work between things that can be changed, that can't be changed, design constraints that can't be changed over the short term, problems that can be changed. And I'll get into sort of the last piece here is about systems change. And certainly this is so much, I think, of what we're confronting today and thankfully of what we're having all these important conversations about with regards to social justice. But there's a great, sort of a great way of looking at systems change from folks at Harvard, this diagram called the water systems change. And if you think about it, you know, we're trying to work on, there wasn't a system for people to go out and sell cook stoves or offer eyeglasses or what have you, all these really important vital opportunities. There wasn't a system to create jobs for doing this. So we were trying to build a system. And so there are these 5 components of, you know, Kanye, Kremer, and Senge point out in what they call the water of systems change, which really, really resonates with me. And I, you know, think about it in all of our work, apart from just simply the micro-consignment model, of course. And so if you think about this, the 6 conditions of systems change, there's sort of the structural explicit change, which is policies, practices, and resource flows. Think about so oftentimes in this work, that's what we focus on. A new program, a new policy, can we give some resources, some inputs? Right? That goes back to that donating a stove. That's a resource flow, right? Solution. But what you find, in short, is that yes, those are certainly necessary. But when real change comes, it's when you're addressing the relationships and connections, right? Ideally, when we did our job well with the micro-consignment model, we built relationships with people. Credit can oftentimes be a transaction. We were able to build a relationship, which helps us to design with. The power dynamics. Right? We put women in new positions of power, right? We didn't put them, excuse me. They opted to come in and work in new positions of power. And then they saw their power grow, which meant that they can offer more things and solve more problems in communities. And most importantly, in mental models, it's about mindset shift. It's about thinking that you are empowered to create change. And this is something that's worth you doing. And that's certainly when you have the mental model, everything else can come from that. Right? And what you learn, if you don't address mindset, and ideally if you don't address it up front, right, you're going to have a lot more challenges in every other part of systems change. Right? So I will actually leave it there for now with, you know, sort of the one final part to this and about the micro-consignment model is that, you know, the way that I see the micro-consignment model, you know, when it's worked well, is apart from all these other components that we learned along the way of what drove them, was it was sort of like a trim tab. And this trim tab is this idea that was first designed by, was first sort of named by Buckminster Fuller, who, you know, who was an inventor. And he actually had on his epitaph on his grave, it said, "Call me trim tab." And a trim tab is essentially, if you think about an aircraft or a ship, you know, you think about the ship, this big ship, let's say, as a system, right? And to turn a ship, right, to turn a system, it takes an incredible amount of energy, right? You just can't do it. You can't change a system by trying to change the system, right? So that's where there's a rudder, right? So then you can steer and you can turn the rudder, but even just using a big rudder requires too much energy, right? You can't change the system, you can't turn the ship, right? But within that rudder, there's a little rudder. It's called a trim tab. And that doesn't require very much energy. And when you turn that little trim tab, it turns the rudder, it turns the ship, right? So in our work, in social innovation, social entrepreneurship, is can you find the trim tab, right? That turns something bigger, that turns something bigger, that turns something bigger, right? And if you can identify that, that's when you can really create change. So in our case, what was the trim tab? It was this idea of taking uncertainty, turning it into risk, saying you can pay for things after you've sold them, not before. And that is what empowered everything else. It's that little thing that makes everything else tick. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. I went certainly longer than I had expected, but maybe it's a little bit of passion about the work and speaking to it. So thank you. I'll stop my share screen right now.
Okay, so we do have a few questions. I know we just have a few more minutes left, but let's see what we can get to.
Yeah, got all the time we need, so yeah.
Awesome. So the first one, you explained the model, but this is a little bit more about getting it started.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how the micro-consignment model is staffed or initiated on the ground and how you recruit the entrepreneurs and other stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, what we learned along the way, certainly, is going out and creating the self-selection model of identifying potential women entrepreneurs. Most of by the way, the women entrepreneurs work part-time. They had not previously been entrepreneurs, but just, wonderful people who cared about helping their communities and their families. And so, that's sort of the on the ground piece. But then in terms of scaling, it's a lot about partnership and collaboration, but overall, it's really about, we create a hub and spoke system where you have a regional leader, let's say in a bigger town, that trains, that identifies and trains and supports women working in teams of 2. It's always better to work in teams of 2 than by yourself in smaller towns. And then those women go out to even smaller towns that are within an hour or 2 to 3 hours and go back and forth doing marketing and doing weekend campaigns. And then to run that, we co-created with our team a local social enterprise so that this could work without us.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Going back to the incentives and disincentives,
Yeah.
you talked about how that was the most challenging aspect of the work. Can you comment on a few of the most salient ones that you've seen, both incentives and disincentives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's overly simplistic, but I think one, we appeal to money too often. I think we appeal to the head too often. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the heart. We also assume that there's rationality in this, right? That we make rational decisions as human beings, and we all make all kinds of irrational decisions in our day. There's some great, work, folks at this book called Influencer, where break down, how do you influence change and what effectuates change? And what I would say is, in summary, there's sort of 3 components. You have the personal component, you have the societal component, and the structural component, right? You have to look at all of that. And then personally, societally, and structurally, right? The question is there the ability and is there the motivation, right? So do I have the personal ability? Do I have the personal motivation? Do I have the societal ability? Think about peer groups. And societal motivation, structural ability, structural motivation, right? And I need to sort of have all 6 of those for something to work. And, one of the things certainly we learned is we had this amazing woman entrepreneur named Olga, who just came from very, very, humilde, we would say in Spanish, background. And she was doing great, and all of a sudden one day she just disappeared. And what we learned over time was that all of her neighbors were saying, why do you get this opportunity and not us? Why do you get to make this money and do this and not us? And so she didn't have the societal motivation, and she had negative peer pressure, not positive peer pressure. And so she quit because it was a lot easier to go back to the inertia of what she used to do than to fight against her entire community, her entire peer group. So you have all kinds of these different things to keep in mind. And it's about learning and just asking a lot of questions about what is it that people really care about the most and how do you design around that?
Yeah, thanks for touching more on that. It really does seem like it's more just about the context and the place that you're in. Moving on to answer a few career development questions we got, more geared towards GESI alums and Northwestern students. A lot of GESI NNU students are interested in careers in international development. So we were wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your career trajectory and how your background in finance and the Peace Corps service led to where you are now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think there's a misconception oftentimes when it comes to, when I talk about, I worked in business and then I quit and went in the Peace Corps. I think people think that, I decided, not gonna, not gonna do this anymore. Capitalism sucks, and I'm gonna throw off my suit and put on a robe and wander the highlands of Guatemala. It actually had nothing to do with that. I sort of I always knew that I wanted to do something that mattered to me, and I also knew that I wanted to get some practical experience. And my parents had worked in business. I think that sort of drove me to work in business as well a little bit. But essentially, I just got to the point where I said, okay, well, I'm about to turn 30. It's kind of now or never. And so fortunately, I had a little bit of a nudge by reading about Muhammad Yunus, and just took the dive. But I think that there's no easy answers. People ask, well, should I go into nonprofit and then into business, then into nonprofit, or what have you? Obviously, everybody's got their own financial situations and constraints and family situations. But again, I think just like I said with the entrepreneurs, it's about follow your heart. It'll turn out one way or the other. I don't think you can plan this. And I think that, as well, I kind of see your 20s, if I can sound really old now, as sort of your R&D. So try out a lot of different things. And then most importantly, you're going to find out what you don't like, and that'll help you figure out what you actually do.
Great. Please join me in thanking Greg Van Kirk for a great presentation. Virtual round of applause. And thank you all for joining us for this week's GLOVicariously webinar. Please join us again next week for our next webinar on the topic of human trafficking and children's rights in Ghana. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Awesome.